So Donald Trump is going to be president again. What now?
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs. The people that came in, they're eating the cats.
It's always loud when he comes here, but now that he's won, now that he's the president again, oh my God.
President-elect Donald Trump has promised big changes across the federal government in his second term. His priorities, his appointed administration officials, and a Republican-led Senate and House of Representatives could mean huge impacts for the policy and funding issues that matter the most to urban planners and the communities that they serve. To give you the lay of the land going into this new administration, we're going to break down the knowns, the unknowns, and everything else you might need to know across three vital strata critical to planners: climate, housing, and transportation. Part 1. Housing supply and affordability. Despite a significant number of voters saying housing was one of their top issues heading into the voting booth, housing supply, particularly housing that is affordable to middle and low-income households, will likely continue to be a major problem nationwide under a Trump administration. Trump has floated 4 policy proposals to address housing costs and scarcity, but they are unlikely to move the needle in a significant way over the next 4 years. Indeed, some economists say they might actually exacerbate the problem. Number 1. Opening federal lands for construction to increase housing supply is a solution floated both by Trump and Kamala Harris on the campaign trail. And in July, Biden called on federal agencies to assess surplus federal land that can be repurposed to build more affordable housing across the country. But surplus federal lands typically aren't located in large urban areas where new housing is needed, so it's not clear if this would have an impact. 2. On the campaign trail, Trump promised to bring down interest rates and, in turn, mortgage prices. During his first term, he pressured the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates but was unsuccessful for a couple of reasons. In a second term, he may be constrained by the same factors. 1. The Fed is an independent entity and not subject to the bidding of the president, though some expect the current Fed chair, Powell, could be replaced, and any new chair would be subject to Senate confirmation, though it is notable that in the time since writing this, Trump has confirmed that he will not ask Powell to step down. And 2. Trump's proposed tariffs and deportation of undocumented immigrants would be likely to increase inflation by making both raw inputs and labor more expensive, most likely prompting the Fed to raise interest rates. 3. Speaking of deportations, President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance have floated their proposed mass deportations of undocumented immigrants as a solution to free up housing supply and lower housing prices. Setting aside the humane issue of tearing people away from their families and communities, mass deportation is guaranteed to disrupt the construction labor market, 30% of which is made up of immigrants. According to the National Immigration Forum, which claims that the industry needed to add 500,000 new workers in 2024 alone to meet new demand, factoring in the potential for mass deportations in 2025 and associated delays in restaffing or a sustained inability to find cost-efficient labor due to a lack of immigrant workers, we can likely expect to see the cost of construction rise significantly over the course of Trump's term, translating to less new homes and higher costs for would-be homeowners. However, the argument upon which Trump's deportation plan is in part built on is that by carrying out his proposed mass deportations, the cost of housing will become cheaper overall. That's because housing units aren't like jobs. If you deport someone working at Target, you're freeing up that job, but removing an entire consumer from the market, damaging the economy overall and reducing the number of jobs available thanks to economic shrinkage. But, unlike their jobs, the deported's housing remains, even if the economy crashes in the process. A small consolation prize for Americans looking for relief from high housing costs. Policy number 4. One policy that could positively impact the number and frequency of new homes being built is Trump's favor of deregulation. There's a lot of red tape around building homes, something which perpetually extends timelines and therefore the overall cost to build. While state and local governments control the majority of regulations around housing construction, the federal government also owns a few, including energy efficiency requirements, Clean Water Act regulations, and requirements that FHA borrowers' homes be up to code, all of which could be loosened or streamlined. These are the knowns, or at least the most logical, easily predictable effects of Trump's core policies for housing in America. There remain, however, the unknowns. As we discussed in our last video on the potential impacts on housing in America were Project 2025 to be implemented under the next conservative administration, a second Trump term is likely to be far more efficient at achieving its goals than the first. There's been much debate as to the veracity of the connection between Donald Trump and the policies enclosed in Project 2025. However, given the most recent spate of picks for Trump's administration, Project 2025 is appearing to be much closer to the president's true agenda than his attempts to distance himself from it would otherwise suggest. Most notably, the president-elect's public vetting of former Trump administration regular and Project 2025 architect Russ Vought for the White House Budget Office serves as an indicator that Trump's claims to have no idea who's behind it
Because I have nothing to do with it, and I'm the one that's running.
hold little water. We highly recommend watching our full video on Project 2025 and its potential impact on housing, but here are some of its key policies that could be enacted in America's near future. 1. Overhauling the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, replacing the, quote, top tier of federal housing officials with politically aligned appointees who are motivated to dismantle progressive and equity-focused policies. 2. Excluding non-citizens from federally assisted housing, meaning both documented and undocumented immigrants, as well as their U.S.-born children, may be excluded from what often serves as a critical lifeline for struggling families. 3. Repealing the affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation. This move would dismantle protections that ensure fair access to federally funded or subsidized housing for women, racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQ+ people, disabled individuals, veterans, and other protected groups. 4. Enacting time limits and work requirements for public housing and, quote, reducing the implicit anti-marriage bias in housing assistance programs, which is to say, favoring those who are in traditional, cisgendered, straight marriages over others in the selection process for public housing. 5. Eliminate the New Housing Supply Fund, which provides resources to community development financial institutions, CDFIs, and nonprofit affordable housing organizations to increase the supply of affordable homes and expand housing options for renters and homeowners. 6. Selling off existing public housing stock. This could lead to a significant reduction in the availability of affordable housing, especially in urban areas where land is at a premium, amplifying the most painful effects of all of the policies previously outlined.
So I think it's important at the outset to broaden the scope just a little bit beyond sort of campaign rhetoric from the Trump camp, but also to look at what happened in Congress and the election impact there, and the fact that we have a Republican trifecta in Washington. I think that has a big impact as we think about the implications on the three issue areas of housing, transportation, and the environment. I'll start with housing in part because I think it's the most promising from a planning perspective. The campaign season was interesting in that all the way around, both parties at the presidential level and very much so at the congressional level, Republicans and Democrats were both talking about the housing crisis and both talking about potential solutions. If you dig a little bit deeper, there have been bipartisan housing-related packages floating around Capitol Hill for a number of years, which isn't surprising when you think about the number of states and localities that have been experimenting and enacting their own sorts of planning-focused reforms to increase housing supply and affordability. So I do think there's the opportunity, at least in the new administration, for housing to be one of the areas that the parties could come together and pick up some of the solutions that have already been talked about. Now, that said, I don't think we're looking at significant increases in funding or subsidies. I think the kinds of reforms that are more likely to come out of Washington are things like incentives, regulatory shifts, changes that encourage updates and regulatory reforms to zoning, planning, land use to improve housing outcomes. So I think on the housing front, there's a real opportunity to lean into the fact that Republican governors have been involved in this, Democratic governors have been involved in this, bipartisan packages. So on the housing front, while nothing will be easy, it never is in Washington, I do think there's a real lane, if you will, for housing policy to move forward over the next 4 years.
Part 2, transportation. When it comes to transportation, federal priorities will shift quite significantly under a second Trump term. Where Biden and the U.S. Department of Transportation prioritized intercity rail, reducing traffic deaths, low and no emissions vehicles, and equitable transit, Trump has favored personal transportation modes, roads, and gas-powered cars and trucks. The good news for planners is that most transportation projects are planned at the state and local level, and on Election Day 2024, voters showed up in favor of funding transportation. 18 of the 25 transportation-related funding measures across the country passed, according to Governing Magazine. All told, voters approved more than $50 billion in new revenue for transportation infrastructure, about half of which will go to public transit, including the creation of 2 major bus rapid transit systems, one in Nashville, Tennessee, and another in Columbus, Ohio. Additionally, Metro Phoenix just approved a brand new freeway funded by a half-cent sales tax, a big win for transit advocates in an area that went to Trump, a phenomenon surprisingly common in this most recent election. That said, many local transportation projects do depend on federal funding to round out their funding packages, and federal grants are awarded at the discretion of the US DOT, subject to the priorities of the current presidential administration. We take our cues from the types of grants awarded to local projects when Trump was last in office. Based on an analysis from the Urban Institute, over the next 4 years, the US DOT's funding priorities under Trump's second term will likely swing back to road projects in rural, majority-white communities and away from projects that promote cleaner, more equitable transportation modes in historically underinvested communities, which had been a key focus of the Biden administration. Zooming out to a national level, how concerned should planners be? Not as much as you might think, according to Beth Osborne of Transportation for America. She recently told Bloomberg, quote, "The world's going to get plenty dark, but transportation is not going to suffer the brunt of it." She doesn't think the Trump administration will be able to make much headway in gutting non-auto transit modes and making a strong push for highway expansion, largely because, quote, "U.S. transportation funding is relatively fixed because of the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law and the rules of the Highway Trust Fund, which makes it less subject to annual appropriations or political turnover." In other words, the Trump administration can rail against transit, walking, and biking in the public forum, but likely won't be able to do as much as they would like in concrete policy terms. Rail. Another question on a lot of transportation planners' minds is how the new Trump administration will impact high-speed rail, particularly long-distance services outside the Northeast Corridor. Under the Biden administration and the IIJA, passenger rail policies have gained momentum nationwide, including the Brightline West project to connect Las Vegas and Southern California, which received $3 billion from the Federal Railroad Administration, and a new Amtrak service between the Twin Cities and Chicago. Just a week before the election, the FRA announced another $2.4 billion grant package through its Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements (CRISI) program that would fund 122 projects in more than 40 states, including 12 in California. But the incoming president has a history of cutting federal funding for rail. In 2017, during his first administration, he slashed the US DOT's budget by 13%, eliminating funding for Amtrak's long-distance routes. In 2019, the Trump administration tried to retract a previously awarded $929 million federal grant for California's bullet train and threatened to cancel another $2.5 billion in federal funds awarded to the California High-Speed Rail Authority. Between that, his desire to slash federal spending overall, and Republican congressional members' continued scrutiny of Amtrak, experts say those fears are well-founded. Rail projects that are already underway, like the B&P tunnel replacement in Baltimore, may avoid cuts because of how far along they are. But endeavors like California's high-speed rail project that are still in early stages could be at risk. In addition to uncertainty around budget cuts, some are concerned about delays in Amtrak and FRA, Federal Railroad Administration, operations during the presidential transition. According to Beth Osborne of Transportation for America, during his last administration, Trump did not staff up the FRA at all. No staff equals no decisions being made equals no grants being awarded or dispersed. If Trump takes that tack again this time around, the delays will push out rail project timelines and potentially drive up project costs, particularly when paired with any tariffs on foreign materials that the Trump administration might impose. One approach for rail projects at risk could be to wait out the new administration and hope for more favorable presidential election results in 2028. Another option, like some are calling for in California, is to scale back the projects so they are less dependent upon federal funding. IIJA. But what about Trump's stated intentions to repeal the bipartisan infrastructure law, which he has called, quote, excessive spending? Passed in 2021, the law, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, is the largest and most comprehensive infrastructure bill in history, authorizing $1.2 trillion for transportation and infrastructure spending. As of November 15th, 3 years into the 5-year law, only 47% of the IIJA funds were announced, leading to speculation on whether Trump can somehow halt the rest of the funds from being distributed.
We have a reauthorization that will come due in the middle of this administration. So in 2026, the current transportation law, the bipartisan infrastructure law, is due for a reauthorization. So there will be a focus on transportation very significantly in terms of what pieces of that program do we want to maintain? How will they change and evolve going forward? I think the most immediate impact that planners should look for, though, if you remember when the bipartisan infrastructure law was enacted, one of its hallmarks was the creation of an array of new discretionary programs, which means unlike the formula programs, which go out automatically based on how much money is available, these programs you have to compete for, which means there's an element of discretion by the Department of Transportation in how those grants will be awarded. One of the things that we saw in the first Trump administration was a shift in terms of the things that they prioritize, which is not a surprise. I think most administrations would follow suit. What we saw the first time around when we look at some of those discretionary grants was that they leaned more toward smaller communities, smaller states, and more toward highway construction and expansion. I think we're likely to see that same sort of tilt this time, which isn't to say that I think other kinds of investments will be ignored. One of the things about the transportation structure is that we have a lot of these formula programs, so there is some opportunity for continuity there. But the Biden administration's heavy focus on things like climate and equity are likely to be downplayed in terms of their role as a fundamental criteria in the evaluation for grants. And again, I think transportation, like all areas of domestic policy, will face fiscal headwinds. This is not a Congress or an administration I think is likely to plus up a lot of investments. So I think on that front, it's going to be maintaining funding levels that we've got and trying to ensure some continuity as we move into the reauthorization.
It's safe to assume the Trump administration will conduct a comprehensive review of IIJA and try to roll back portions of the bill he deems excessive. Fortunately, experts say that, much like the Inflation Reduction Act, it's unlikely he will be able to completely defund initiatives that are carved out in the law, including programs like Reconnecting Communities grants, which are meant to help cities address problems related to past infrastructure projects like urban highways, and the Safe Streets and Roads for All program, which funds planning and implementation of street safety improvements. Those programs, along with the bulk of the IIJA, should be safe through 2026, when they are scheduled to sunset. At that point, whether or not a Republican-controlled Congress will renew them remains to be seen. In the meantime, short of a repeal by Congress, the Trump administration and US DOT leadership will be limited in the actions that they can take to hold execution of the law. The Highway Trust Fund Solvency/gas tax. Alongside a bevy of other regulations, policies, and projects, the Highway Trust Fund will be up for reauthorization ahead of the midterm elections in 2026. The questions of the day will be how to keep it solvent and at what level it will be funded. The HTF is the largest single source of federal funding for surface transportation, and it's forecast to become completely insolvent by 2028. Its funding primarily comes from federal gas taxes, but because those haven't been raised since the 1990s, the trust fund has been operating at a deficit for years, unable to keep up with rising costs of building and maintaining surface transportation infrastructure like roads and bridges. Further complicating the matter, the HTF reauthorization will coincide with the reauthorization of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, which we just talked about, which also provides significant additional investment in surface transportation funding. What approach will the Trump administration and Republican-controlled Congress take? It's unclear at this stage, but will definitely be something to keep an eye on. And once again, we return our focus to the possibility of the Trump administration hardliners getting their way like the authors of Project 2025 are hoping. With regards to transportation, Project 2025 entails 1. Abolishing all discretionary grants from the US DOT. This would entail passing along all grants to state-level departments of transportation as block grants. This change would decrease the ability of the federal government to incentivize projects that align with environmental, community, or equity-focused objectives and give broad leeway to the states to prioritize spending. 2. Remove federal subsidies for transit spending, making new transit projects untenable. 3. Halt the use of federal highway dollars for projects like bike lanes and sidewalks, rendering each dollar spent on transportation infrastructure much more likely to lead to another highway lane, rather than walkable solutions for the communities that need them. 4. Transfer control over fuel economy levels to the US DOT. These levels have been dictated by the NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, since 1975 in conjunction with the EPA's emission goals. However, Project 2025 states that, quote, any EPA limits on carbon dioxide emissions, even if authorized under the Clean Air Act, must support and work in harmony with DOT standards and must not override them or usurp DOT's regulatory role. 5. Eliminate policies it considers outside the FHWA's statutory authority, including equity and Vision Zero. levying major blows to climate and equity-minded transportation professionals and activists. Part 3. Environmental and climate. Federal environmental regulations do a lot of heavy lifting for us. They conserve landscapes, protect the quality of water and air, ensure the safety of wildlife, and support sustainability and resilience in the face of climate change. Biden did more to combat climate change than any other president, championing the transition to clean energy, cutting carbon emissions, and conserving public lands. And of course, Trump has promised to roll these policies back. Environmental regulations. During his first term, the Trump administration attempted to cut the EPA's budget by a third and rolled back more than 100 environmental regulations, including repealing a critical part of the Clean Water Act and loosening limits on emissions from power plants and vehicles. He issued executive orders curbing the National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, and Clean Water Act in order to speed up permits for federal infrastructure projects. His 3 Supreme Court justice appointees also overturned the Chevron doctrine, all but gutting the federal government's ability to enforce environmental protections. Environmental experts expect a Trump-led Environmental Protection Agency to take the same approach in a second term. Shortly after the election results came in, UCLA experts Ann Carlson and Kara Horowitz predicted that if Trump appointees to agencies like the EPA are inexperienced in the federal government, they could fail to conform to basic requirements of environmental law, including the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the IRA. They predict that it will fall upon nonprofit environmental groups in states like California to hold the administration accountable through litigation in the courts. In keeping with this prediction, Trump recently announced his pick for EPA Secretary, Lee Zeldin, a Trump loyalist who is well known for his hostility towards the EPA's regulatory power, in addition to having very limited experience regarding climate policy. Public lands. The same goes for policies around public lands. According to an article from Bloomberg, environmental groups are preparing for, quote, copious litigation in the coming years to hold the line against the second Trump administration's efforts to open up federal land for fossil fuels and other development. During his previous term, Trump enacted the largest slashing of federal land protections in history when he shrank 2 national monuments in Utah to open up the land for oil and gas development, something Trump says he will support in his second term. The Trump-Vance campaign's official Platform 47 says, quote, President Trump will free up the vast stores of liquid gold on America's public land for energy development and, quote, remove all red tape that is leaving oil and natural gas projects stranded.
I guess lastly on the environmental side, that encompasses a lot of territory. So I think the incoming administration has been most vocal on energy-related policies.
Drill, baby, drill.
And I think we will see an early focus during the first 100 days on the energy side of the environmental ledger. And that will entail things like promoting liquefied natural gas export facilities that had been held up by the Biden administration, probably some other provisions that are more friendly, if you will, to oil and gas. But one of the interesting areas I think planners should focus on in the energy space is the issue of permitting reform. This is another area that has engendered a fair amount of bipartisan interest. There are bipartisan bills still pending in the lame duck session that if you're a green energy proponent, there are still a lot of challenges to actually getting the permitting and the reviews to ensure that those renewable energy sources are actually living up to their potential. So this is a potential space where I think planners would play an important role because that permitting involves land use decision making and other kinds of things that they would be directly involved in. So that's one to keep a close eye on.
From an air quality and climate mitigation standpoint, Trump has promised to roll back Biden-era fuel efficiency standards for gas-powered vehicles, as well as EPA vehicle emission standards, something he did in 2020 with the Obama-era guidelines, and now hopes to do with Biden's. In addition to changing EPA vehicle emission standards, Trump has promised to, quote, end the electric vehicle mandate on day one of his presidency, and has floated the idea of eliminating the federal $7,500 EV tax credit. He has also promised to end all Biden administration incentives to encourage EV market development. However, in light of his close relationship with Tesla CEO Elon Musk, it remains to be seen whether Trump will follow through with these steps, which could have a direct and massively negative impact on Musk's business interests. To Tesla and other vehicle manufacturers, the $7,500 federal EV credit functions like a free point-of-sale discount, one which is roughly equivalent to a 10% discount on a Tesla Model S, and which serves as a strong motivator for consumers switching from gas to electric. However, it's possible that Trump's plans to ease the rules for autonomous vehicles, as recently reported by Bloomberg, will be the political trade-off for his technocratic friends like Elon Musk. The subject of autonomous vehicles is one that has, in the past half-decade, crossed the boundary of being perpetually 5 years away. And thus, Trump's decisions in regards to AVs over the next 4 years could play a substantial role in defining the future of transit in America. Trump has recently signaled that he intends to establish a new federal regulatory framework for AVs, something that's caused much rejoicing amongst industry leaders, most notably Elon Musk, whose company Tesla is perhaps the #1 beneficiary of a path to mass adoption for AVs. A federal regulatory framework for AVs would certainly speed up their adoption, but planners have voiced a growing number of concerns regarding how this technology will impact traffic congestion, road safety, and public transit usage. Climate change. Given Trump's promise to gut fuel efficiency standards, vehicle emission standards, and EV incentives, it's not crazy to think that climate change is bound to get worse under a new Trump administration. Under his previous administration, he pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord in 2019, saying the pledges made by the U.S. imposed, quote, unfair economic burden on American workers, businesses, and taxpayers. He has announced his intentions to withdraw again after Biden rejoined it in 2021, as well as his goal of boosting fossil fuel production, which will negatively impact any progress toward emission reduction that the U.S. has made under the Biden administration. Meanwhile, worldwide greenhouse gas emissions rose to an all-time high last year, according to the UN, and this summer, the Northern Hemisphere experienced its warmest summer on record, with devastating tropical storms battering the southeast, nearly one-half of all people on Earth experiencing dangerous summer temperatures on and around July 22nd, 2024, to this date, the hottest day in Earth's history. While it's a common debate amongst planners whether climate change falls within planners' professional purview, there's no denying that rising global temperatures are having major impacts on communities nationwide, both coastal and inland. Planners are on the front lines in terms of preparing for, mitigating, and recovering from events that are exacerbated by warmer temperatures, like intensified storms, wildfires, flooding, extreme heat, drought, air, and water quality crises. The clean energy transition. Another thing that's unlikely to be impacted too drastically by a second Trump term, believe it or not, is America's transition to clean energy. Trump is a big fan of fossil fuels, judging by his frequently uttered catchphrase of drill, baby, drill, and criticism of wind turbines and electric cars. Additionally, he has promised to rescind the remaining funding from the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, aka the IRA, which contains spending and tax breaks to boost clean energy like solar and wind.
The other big issue as it relates to the environment is the fate of Inflation Reduction Act programs, particularly those focused on climate action planning, other kinds of resilience programs. Those will certainly be in some degree of jeopardy, although if history is a guide, those programs are difficult to claw back. I think we're more likely to see no expansion as opposed to significant reductions in the programs that are already in place. But I guess the last thing I would say about the environmental space here is this is an area that will be ripe with symbolism for the new administration. So things that arguably don't have a huge day-to-day impact, they may have a huge macro impact, but things like pulling out of UN climate accords and other sorts of international activities, you're going to see that because I think that's important rhetoric, for the administration. We saw that in the first go around.
While the Trump administration might be able to slow down the clean energy transition, it's highly unlikely they'll be able to stop it completely. According to Reuters, that's because of a few reasons. One, costs for a majority of clean energy technologies are falling fast, making them very competitive. Two, energy companies are under pressure from their customers and investors to deal with climate change, and it has been speculated that oil companies facing the reality of a transforming energy economy have begun to re-optimize their businesses for extracting as much profit as possible from existing oil assets, rather than looking to expand their market share by investing in new oil drilling infrastructure. And three, the $369 billion in subsidies granted to wind, solar, and clean fuel infrastructure under the IRA will be nearly impossible to repeal. Why, you ask? Because changing or repealing it completely or in part would require action from Congress, and Republican districts have received more than 3/4 of the $268 billion in clean energy investments announced so far, according to the Global Infrastructure Investor Association. Pundits predict there likely won't be enough political will on the Republican side of the aisle to halt that flow of dollars. 18 House Republicans signaled as much in August when they sent a letter to House Speaker Mike Johnson asking him to focus on business and market certainty as he considers efforts to change or gut the IRA. That said, there are a few ways Trump could chip away at the IRA, including repealing certain provisions like tax credits for clean vehicles and clean fuel, as well as impacting how certain programs are administered, including reallocating funds within existing frameworks to prioritize oil and gas infrastructure, rewriting regulations that impact how quickly projects are approved, and emphasizing public-private partnerships. But the broad consensus is that while it may face a few bumps in the road, the IRA is not at risk by and large, and the clean energy transition will continue on, if slightly delayed in its progress under the Trump administration. In the meantime, Biden has been fighting a rearguard action to future-proof some of his administration's policies and priorities against potential rollback by the next Trump administration. For example, a week after the election, Biden's administration asked the European Union to ensure liquefied natural gas shipments that meet U.S. methane regulations automatically comply with Europe's standards for imports. Linking U.S. and EU methane standards means any future shipments will meet Biden's methane rule requirements, regardless of whether Trump reverses them. His administration has also limited the amount of oil drilling that can take place in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge by opening the lowest amount of acreage it could legally offer for lease under a Trump-era law that required the federal government to hold 2 lease sales there for fossil fuel drilling. That said, the progress that the federal government has made towards combating climate change is crucially threatened by President Trump. And of course, Project 2025 contains even more hardline recommendations for the 47th President's administration to follow if he so chooses. Berkeley Law segments Project 2025's climate-focused policies as follows. 1. Reform regulations and reduce regulatory burdens. This entails restoring Trump-era executive orders that limited regulations, such as requiring the elimination of 2 regulations for every new one, and restricting agency guidance documents. 2. Increase roles of policy appointees relative to career staff. Trump can do this by implementing executive orders to reclassify government positions that influence policy, replacing experts with politically aligned appointees, and encouraging these political appointees to oversee high-level positions in agencies like the EPA and central personnel agencies. 3. Decentralize, privatize, and make bureaucracy more politically responsive. Project 2025 goes so far as to advocate for the transfer of government environmental responsibilities up to and including nuclear waste disposal to the private sector in order to increase efficiency and reduce taxpayer burden. 4. Concentrate decision-making power at the state level while decreasing states' abilities to create regulations stricter than the federal government. This specifically entails rescinding California's waiver under the Clean Air Act, thus limiting states' ability to impose stricter environmental standards than federal rules. 5. Manufacturing a conservative and compliant EPA. In sum, this means decreasing the EPA's ability to actually enforce anything, while simultaneously changing its staffing makeup in order to make it more compliant to Trump's whims.
The other piece that affects all 3 of the categories you mentioned, housing, transportation, energy, and the environment, is the fact that one of the real immediate impacts of the fact that Republicans control both houses of Congress and the White House is that they will have the ability to use a tool known as reconciliation, which basically allows them to get a big package through the Senate without having to attract 60 votes. So for many of the things that we've been talking about here, that 60 vote threshold is going to act as a historic break, as it always does on massive change, because a number of Democrats will have to come along. But when it relates to reconciliation, that isn't the case. So when we think back to some of the big signature legislative achievements in the Biden administration, those were often done through reconciliation. So the question becomes, what is reconciliation likely to contain? And the answer to that question largely is tax-related provisions, because the original Trump tax programs, those cuts back from 2017, they all expire in 2025. So for Republicans, this is an opportunity to bake those into the tax code for a longer period of time, and also to use the tax code to advance other kinds of priorities. So just for instance, from a housing perspective, there may be an opportunity to leverage bipartisan support to see an expansion of the low-income housing tax credit. We know that opportunity zones are also a program up for renewal that has a lot of Republican interest and support. So what's going to happen in that space? So I think tax policy, even though it's not, I think, by many planners considered to be core to our interests, is going to be an initial important area of policy action in Washington.
That brings us to the end of our analysis for today. However, there remain massive unanswered questions with regards to Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy's advisory body, the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, Whether the recommendations of this agency, which has promised nebulous but massive sweeping cuts to the federal government, up to and including cutting the entire Department of Education, are actually followed, will be a major determinant of the course of the Trump administration and the future of the American people, their cities, and the people that plan them.